Thank you so much for joining the Sociology of Education webinar series. I'd like to welcome you on behalf of CASE, Canadian Association of Sociology of Education, as well as CSA, the Canadian Sociological Association, to our webinar today, The Ethics Dilemma, the Impact of Research Ethics, Review on Research Activities, Teaching and Learning. I'd like to start by acknowledging land where I am. I'm here from Treaty 1 territory, the unceded and traditional ancestral territory of the Anishinaabe, the Nahiawak, the Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene people, and homeland of the Red River Métis. I'd like to invite everyone to think about and acknowledge the Indigenous territory that they're on. Feel free to put something in the chat about it or the Q&A so that we know where everybody is coming from. But it's important that we all reaffirm our commitments to Indigenous territory learning to build respectful relational relationships and think about our responsibilities in that regard. I invite you to learn more at https://nativeland.ca. And for engaging in the conversation today, we will have closed captioning as a live transcript. Please hold on to your questions or that you can put into the Q&A. We'll be addressing questions after the initial discussion. And rather than repeating a lot of questions, what we can do is you can vote something that you think about as connected to another question. So today's presentation, we were very honored to have a really robust group of scholars here today. So as we said, that's the ethics dilemma, the impact of research ethics review on research activities, teaching and learning, brought to you by Dr. Kerr Robson from full professor from McMaster University, Alexandra Pulchny from Ph.D. candidate, also from McMaster, as well as Dr. Kelly Gallagher-Mackay from associate professor from Wilfrid Laurier University. So I am going to send this over to them to get started. Looking forward to your presentation, everybody, and welcome.
Thank you, Jeannie, Alana, and Sherry for this. I'm just waiting for my slides to appear. Thank you. And thank you all for attending today. The last time I was here, I was complaining about something else, and today I'll be complaining about research ethics boards. And I just want to acknowledge that this work was mostly done by Kelly. We were sitting in a lobby of a hotel preparing for our joint panel where we were complaining about data infrastructure when we decided that this really upset us too. And in the lobby of the Delta, this project was born. And many of you are probably here because you received our survey. So I just want to acknowledge that the real PI of this is Kelly, and my doctoral student Alexandra has really put in a lot of great work with the data analysis here. So the first part of this presentation is going to be Kelly taking us through the legal and other literature that binds the TCPS. Then we'll talk about the methods and the findings, and then our recommendations. So I'm going to hand it over to Kelly at this point.
Hi, and it's really nice to be here. I love that CASE does this series. And I'm really grateful to Alana for all the work she puts in to make it happen, and to Jeannie, and Sherry for contributing as well. My background is actually law and society, which means I look at law from a social perspective. And one of the central insights of law and society is it's not just parliaments that make law. We have all kinds of regulators out there. And one of them is the Tri-Council, which is, of course, the three research councils responsible for public funding of universities and colleges across Canada. And they use their financial power to create a code of ethics that governs what PSE-affiliated researchers do in the way of research across Canada. And it governs it because you can't get any grants as a post-secondary institution if you don't abide by this policy. And furthermore, it governs it because most academics really believe in the importance of research ethics. So it's a very legitimate regime. It's so legitimate that many of you may have forgotten that until 1998, which is, while I was doing my master's work, we didn't have a tri-council policy that bound us all. We had to sort of muddle along, and often, frankly, postsecondary institutions and their researchers did not do a good enough job of thinking about the rights and interests of participants in the context of research. From the very extreme cases that kind of drove this big international push to much more ordinary malfeasance, there was a lot that needed work, culture change, and possibly even some regulation. So the goal of establishing and enforcing standards to protect human dignity in the conduct of research was one that there was a lot of sort of moral impetus behind. And as you probably all know, one of the requirements of the Tri-Council policy statement is that each institution will set up their own research ethics board to administer policy and to manage the sort of joys of academic freedom at each institution. They'll all have slightly different rules and practices. This has gone from not existing to being a very, very well-established part of the post-secondary landscape. Back in 2010, Professor van den Hoenaard estimated that $35 million in direct spending, plus the service of countless academics, and I'm sure many of you have done work on these boards to try and strengthen the research enterprise. And I mean, I also have to say I've gotten a lot of help from REB people. So this is a critique, but it's a critique that recognizes the need, the goodwill and the high investment. Alexandra, can we keep going? So back in the years leading up to 1998, there was actually a very hot debate about how to strike a balance between protection of human dignity and the public interest in encouraging and promoting research. And I hope that in speaking to all of you, it's not news that there is an acute public interest in the research enterprise, in what we're supposed to do with a big chunk of our time. We, through our efforts, broaden what we know, especially important to hear from vulnerable and marginalized groups. We support innovation, we inform public debate and public policy. We're an important part of a rich network of accountability. The public interest in research is a very serious interest. And when they were first creating the REB system, there was a real concern about how would research ethics regulation can impact that public interest. And we think that debate has kind of gotten lost. We've gotten so focused on this is my opinion anyway, on the sort of minutia of the REB process that we've stopped looking at that fundamental balance. And so that's where our project came from. We're doing something called a regulatory impact assessment. That's what you call it in Law and Society, which is assuming that just because we've made rules with good intentions, that we should know how they're working. If we care about what we're trying to regulate, then we have a sort of responsibility to check in on the effectiveness of what we're doing and on unintended effects. So this study fits into that paradigm. It only looks at part of it. The first question, are TCPS2 and the REB review system achieving their goals? I have to say there's not very much research on that either. And even in a very broad international literature, which when my former research assistant, Katerina Diamakis, and I were looking into it, her first search turned up 1,500 sources on REBs across North America and Britain. Systematic reviews of that research ethics process revealed back in 2015, one, we do not have a standard for what it means to be successful as an REB in protecting the interests of research participants. So we don't actually know what success would look like. And to the extent we've investigated how they're working, only 4% of empirical studies actually focused on participants as opposed to researchers. We unfortunately are part of the 96% of studies focusing on researchers. But boy, if you're looking for a research project, it looks like there's some need in that area. So our focus is on the unintended impacts of the REB review system in Canada on those core PSE purposes. And it's interesting that the original debate was really about research versus ethics, and it's not a versus, but research and ethics, but we wanted to add teaching, which we think is a fundamental purpose, because our sense is that REB is having some of its biggest impacts on the system in the space of teaching. There is a lot of literature about this, but very little of it looks at the scope of the impact. Like, how widespread a problem is this? Is this just what we all like to rant about, or is this widespread? And so I did think it was important that we look at the literature. There is as I say, a very big one. And I want to very quickly run through that literature and look at those key critiques. Probably the most important Canadian article was written by Kevin Haggerty way back in 2004. He talked about a phenomenon he called ethics creep. So there's two things going on at the same time. On the one hand, the system is starting to cover more and more things, more and more risks. You can think back on your own experience as to whether the scope of the risks being regulated has expanded. And at the same time, intensification of the activities that are being regulated. So I want to ask you to think on your own experience. Have those consent letters gotten longer and longer? Recently, they've started adding that you need to get permission from your research participant about how quotes are used. 5 years ago, that didn't exist. So an intensification of the things that are being regulated, or the ways that that's regulating. So that's ethics creep. And that, as you can see, made it into our title. We think it's a really important phenomenon. Next, there's a couple of terrific studies by my colleagues in Law and Society, Alison Taylor at UBC. There's questioning the focus on research ethics as a risk management exercise. First of all, she points that the closer you push towards social change, which is really, when we say promoting innovation, we also might say promoting social change. Research that aims to foment change is by definition risky, right? Because it's asking for us to change the status quo. And furthermore, that the focus on risk management has come to often be about protecting institutional reputations, managing liability, concern a shield for the university more than the participants. The next body of literature is really about the ways in which REB processes continue, despite major efforts and the participation of lots of qualitative researchers on it, to sort of flatten disciplinary differences. The origins of research ethics does come from abuses in the medical field, and there is a certain kind of ideal type of how the research enterprise works that comes out of the medical model and affects all of us. The argument has been made that that medical model effectively constrains research design. Professor Van den Hunard, one of Canada's leading REB scholars, was an ethnographer, and he was really acutely aware of the ways in which traditional ethnography has been really challenged by the pressures of the REB process. And I think that many of us have been working towards doing community-based and community-engaged research. One of the things the REB process tends to do is push a kind of top-down researcher-participant relationship where everything's figured out in advance. That's really antithetical to the goals of respectful, reciprocal, community-based research. There's a pile of critique about surveillance. It is a system by which the university oversees what research is going to happen. And there's a lot of literature that highlights that there's particularly intensive or insensitive or intrusive scrutiny when we get to what we might consider risky subjects. So it's really not a surprise to see that some of the most intense critique of the REB system comes out of areas like queer studies, critical criminology, or international human rights. where people are facing multiple dimensions of marginalization at the core. Perhaps the most gritty, not necessarily exciting or theoretical set of critiques about RABs is that they impose incredible delay. And there's a focus on substance, on process over substance, some of which may actually adversely affect participation. There's a huge literature around multi-sited research, arguing, and places like the New England Journal of Medicine have argued that actually the process of requiring multiple reviews actually doesn't just promote redundancy and cost, but creates problems because it imposes protocol variation as each REB makes up their own mind about what's really required here. And finally, particular pet peeve of mine, the sort of integration of REBs into external processes where the legitimacy of the REB kind of cloaks a whole range of purposes on the part of institutions like schools or community agencies or universities themselves, makes the REB kind of complicit in some gatekeeping processes that may in fact work to limit scrutiny of a lot of public institutions and corporations and others. So it starts getting involved in things that aren't ethically really relevant. My final area of the literature, which is a newer area, there's a lot of really rich scholarship. It's not that new. If you think about Baptiste, she was writing about it in 2008. This deep tension in the context of decolonizing research. On the one hand, recognizing that Indigenous persons have been some of those most adversely affected by unethical research, combined with the fundamental problem of putting a university-based institution in charge of figuring out what ethics is going to look like. That actually reinscribes a colonial relationship with Indigenous participants and communities. So questions of control with respect to community-based processes are big ones here. Problematic ignorance of Indigenous methodologies and ethical frameworks, and unclear relationships with the OCAP principles, which are widely respected: ownership, control, access, and possession. RAB rules and OCAP rules don't actually work particularly well together. And my favorite example of this is the RAB requirement of confidentiality with the ownership of data by communities. Like, how do you reconcile these? This is not straightforward. And the result seems to be more bureaucracy. So I think that's the literature. And that's the setup. And I hope it gives you stuff to think about when you're looking at our findings.
So now we're going to move on to our findings of the survey that we did last year, and I'm going to let Alexandra lead us through the beginning of that.
Okay, thank you. So I'll start with our methods. So we obtain RAB approvals from Laurier and McMaster, and we used a convenience sample to reach out to our participants. We tried to recruit first through scholarly associations. Of the 82 that Kelly and her research assistant reached out to, 15 of them agreed to circulate or post our survey information and our poster. We also shared our survey on social media through formats like LinkedIn, X, and Instagram. And we also obtained a recent email list of all faculty in anthropology, economics, political science, and sociology from one of Karen's colleagues. And we ended up with 620 unique respondents from 58 institutions. So we want to provide a bit of a breakdown of what our respondents look like. So 76% of our respondents are faculty members. This includes those from universities or colleges, regardless of their contract status. 14% were students, and this would include master's and PhD students and a few undergraduate students. And then 10% were other researcher, and the other researchers were able to state their position. And this included, but it's not limited to, administrators, librarians, non-faculty researchers, lab managers, adjuncts or emerita, research coordinators, postdoctoral students, and independent scholars. So in our survey, we asked, have you ever been deterred from undertaking research because of actual or perceived requirements and/or workload associated with the REB process? Of those who responded, 58% said yes. So 58% said that they have been deterred from undertaking research because of actual or perceived requirements and/or workload associated with their REB process. Just some examples of why our respondents have dropped their research. This includes there being no resolution when permissions were denied, not continuing with a project due to unnecessary expectations of double-checking sources for a content analysis, and another talked about abandoning research due to unreasonable demands to avoid coercion, anonymity, and consent with a minimal risk research project. So we also asked, has the actual or perceived effort of going through your institution's REB deterred you from doing research that involves any of the following methods of data collection? And again, of those who responded, 78% were deterred from conducting interviews, 43% were deterred from conducting surveys, 14% deterred from routine measurement, and then 16% all answered none of the above. And the important takeaway here is that these aren't necessarily complex or intrusive studies that people are doing, that they are actually being deterred from doing research with these methods. So we also looked at how REB review frequently shapes research and design or topics. So 23% of our respondents who responded to this question noted that the REB involvement resulted in a change of their question or topic. Notably, 22% of respondents found that the REBs made helpful suggestions. And in terms of major changes, in some cases, respondents shared personal anecdotes about their experiences. Want to provide a few quotes. So first, quote, without identifiers, it's impossible to track between pre and post surveys. Small samples made comparisons impossible. Progression of development needed to be removed. And my board objects to integrated classroom interventions in primary schools because the integration requires opt-out or affirmative consent from all students and parents, making it impossible. And some other major changes included flagging experiments specifically in economics for financial incentives, but it's important to note that economic incentives are an important part of what economists study, and that a lot of economics journals won't even publish experiments where participants are not rewarded based on their performance. And then one respondent cited a shift in research completely due to an inability to study racist organizations, individuals, and movements. So that hindered the researchers and everyone's ability to understand racism. And I am handing it back over to Karen.
Thanks, Alex. It's always great when you're doing a study and you collect data on your study in the process of doing the study. And so, of course, we had to go through an REB, and we perceived our study as being minimal risk. But our was this McMaster REB? I can't remember which REB it was, either McMaster or Laurier, said that we this is from the REB feedback that we got. You mentioned not anticipating any risks whatsoever, but you also say that the current research will be insightful for more informed evaluation of the balance of risks and benefits of the review system as a whole. To that end, won't some participants experience negative feelings as they contemplate the risks of the review system? Blah, 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 blah. So we had to put in some language around the possibility of experiencing some emotional risk in our study. Whether or not that was helpful, I'm not sure, but this is the sort of feedback that you get on minimal risk research. Some other findings that we had were involving significant impacts on research involving identity data. So look at demographic stuff that sociologists are really interested in. So the percent of faculty who avoided looking at these identity factors because they expected the REB to scrutinize or delay their research was 54%. So over half of researchers are avoiding looking at these factors because they anticipate this sort of delay with their research. It also has a significant impact on our understanding of vulnerable groups. So again, another thing that sociologists want to look at is vulnerable groups. So one of our questions was, have you designed research that avoids questions concerning vulnerable populations? And vulnerable populations are just like, there's lots that you can put in here, but like the elderly or children, for example, because you suspect it will lead to additional REB scrutiny or delay. And of the people that answered this, 70% said that they had. One example from the open-ended part of the questionnaire was that the REB pointed out that doing case study work with children, so anybody under 18, is difficult, and that it was best to focus the project on young adults. So this eliminates the ability to study children, essentially, or makes it extremely difficult. If you've ever had the experience of doing multi-institutional research, I'm sure you've had the experience of every REB coming up with some sort of different answer to whether or not your study is ethical. So of those who conducted research across Canadian institutions, 70% reported that they had been subjected to substantive review by another institution requiring a new protocol. So, and even, I mean, just an aside here, I know that the college system has its consortium, so it has a integrated all college application, but I've used that, and individual colleges say that they didn't, so that we still had to go through ethics review at every college that we wanted to collect data from. So even where these like multi-institutional consortiums exist, where they've agreed upon protocol, they're not always followed. So the quotes here, I've written applications to many universities across Canada and received very different responses to the same project. How does that make sense? And if you've had the experience of working abroad with people that aren't subject to these sorts of, like in Europe, where they don't have REBs by and large, they are completely bamboozled by the kinds of changes that we have to make to our projects on the fly when we get these sorts of criticisms. Next slide. So when we were recruiting, and if you answered our survey, thank you. You much appreciated. But even when we were recruiting for this, we got an email response from the REB at UNB, and this is part of the email response that we got that said, as manager of the Research Ethics Board, like we didn't email the Research Ethics Board at UNB. They emailed us because somebody had forwarded our survey to them. It came to my attention that you are recruiting participants for your study here at UNB. I reviewed all of the external REB requests we currently have on file, and I do not appear to have a record of you applying for access to our populations. In order to receive this clearance, you will need to submit your REB application and approval. Please do not recruit any further UNB participants until such time that your clearance is in place. which was bizarre to us. I don't know how many studies I get in my email box per week, people wanting to do surveys on professors, but I didn't. This is the first time we've heard that we had to apply to every institution that we were going to recruit from, where there was publicly posted email addresses. So this interpretation at that REB was significantly different than at ours. This also creeps into teaching. So I've been teaching about 20 years, and when I teach research methods, I used to teach research methods almost exclusively when I was at York. And one of the things about teaching research methods is you learn by doing. Well, as time went on, it became more and more impossible for that to be easy. So trying to get, like if you have a class of 200 and you want them all to do different projects, that's about 200 different applications. If you want them all to do one project, well, I guess it's a lot easier, but it doesn't allow students to really get their hands dirty with data, to understand these processes, to understand how surveys are done, what the mistakes that you make, the sorts of really granular sorts of issues that come from working with data, qualitative or quantitative. And this is the percentage of faculty who are avoiding designing assignments with data collection because they worry about these sorts of REB delays or the workload associated with. So that's 70%, over 70% of faculty are taking that out. And it's eroding methods training in Canada, in my opinion. And these are professors that have told students that don't do a project that involves collecting primary data because of the problems you're going to run into with REBs. And I tell my own students that can we just work with my data that's already been cleared, because we don't want to spend months and months arguing with the REB, because this is you have a timeline to finish here. So 58% of people who answered this question said that they were dissuading students from collecting primary data. Again, losing critical skills in the creation of like skilled social scientists. And then there's often times where students have placements where we're helping community organizations with research is the goal. But the percentage of faculty are reporting that students are unable to do research during these placements because of REB concerns is also quite concerning. This is a quarter of students in placements, of the people that answer this question are saying that the students are not able to do this sort of research with community organizations because of the REB concerns around that. So there are exemptions to REB, to requiring REB. It's outlined in the TCPS2. You might not be aware of this. 42% of our respondents weren't aware that quality and improvement studies, program evaluation activities, and performance reviews are testing within normal educational requirements when used exclusively for assessment, management, or improvement purposes are exempt from review by your research ethics board. So if you're doing anything like this and you've been required to do an REB, you shouldn't have been, because it's not in the TCPS as a requirement for these sorts of studies. And then there's other exemptions. Researchers required to have a project with fully de-identified data going through the REB. Shouldn't have to do that. But 37% of respondents have. And I've had to do this too. I've been told that my fully de-identified data has to go through REB for reasons I don't understand. They told me that because at one point in the existence of this data, it had identifiers on it, even though I wasn't privy to them, that it must be scrutinized by REB. And like, it makes no sense to me, but this is how the interpretation of these rules is being carried out at REBs in Canada. So to conclude, a synopsis here is that our current research ethics procedures have educational and very symbolic functions, but the bureaucracy in which they're enacted, in effect, is stifling research. The impact is not just on research, it's on teaching and learning. And this is serious. It's preventing students from gaining their hands-on, rich, supervised experiences with data collection, cleaning, analysis, and all the things that make good social researchers. And through the discontent, efforts to mitigate research ethics currently have limited impact. There's little awareness, low compliance by RABs with direction to lighten the scrutiny. So as a result, we have some suggestions. We have come armed with some suggestions. So in the United States, they have something called the Common Rule for protecting human subjects. And if you are a low risk, minimal risk survey or minimal risk research, you're exempt from their IRB process. There's a form you have to fill out that does this. Although I'm told that there are IRBs don't follow this either to some extent. All REBs subject to Tri-Council authority should be required by the Tri-Council to post on their main homepage a simple process with a short form, please, that's standardized across Canada for determining whether or not research is exempt from review. It's because people don't know, and a lot of times they're, and in non-insignificant amount of times they're putting in review for things that shouldn't have to be reviewed. The Tri-Council should exercise its spending power to require that institutions subject to its authority accept the reviews conducted by other REBs directly subjected to the same rules that they are. It makes no sense that different REBs are coming up with different problems to your research, to your proposed research. If they're following the rules, it should be all the same. And REBs should limit their involvement in gatekeeping activities separate from the protection of research participants. So just follow the rules and don't try to gatekeep us from the studies that we're trying to do. And don't try to invent all of these scenarios that probably won't happen in the course of our daily research. And that is all we have.
Thank you so much. This is really an enlivening conversation. I think obviously most researchers almost exclusively in Canada have to deal with REBs and may have sat on REBs. So it's really interesting to pull all of this kind of perspective of researchers going through this as well as students. So I would like to, I'm just going to check the Q&A. All of you greatly. This is an amazing piece of work. There, like you say, there is so little research being done, and all of this sheds great light on what we're doing. So this webinar is being recorded without the Q&A session, all depending with names, and we'll have that widely available. But we'd like to really thank you for all of your contributions and your willingness to come and share with us and engage in conversations to help us all understand things more deeply.